Hi everybody. In this lecture what I wanted to do was cover the benefit transfer method for environmental valuation. So let's get into it. Okay, we've talked about quite a few different types of methods to monetize environmental attributes in different ways. So we had that overall valuation framework where we looked at direct values and non-use values, indirect values, and we've talked about some different methods that we can use to estimate them or to monetize them, to place a monetary value on a non-market traded good or service. So what we're talking about here with benefit transfer is something slightly different. So rather than applying this as a primary survey method like we would do with the contingent valuation or collecting data, for instance, on property values, environmental attributes like we might do in travel cost, the benefit transfer method is actually where we use the research results from some pre-existing primary studies at potentially one or more sites, and then take those findings and apply them to another location. So in other words, we take the results from one situation and we extrapolate it to another situation. So typically we refer to the original site where primary research was conducted as the study site, and then where we're going to transfer these estimate values to as the policy site. And that's because typically, there's many instances in policy making where we're trying to decide, should we change that land use value from a local, forested area into a subdivision. So that policy decision then is what makes it the policy site. So benefit transfer is actually quite commonly used, and the reason is that there's a large cost, both time and resources and technical skill requirements and so on, to conduct the primary research to come up with the values for this new policy site. So very often, given constraints on those, instead we use this benefit transfer method, which is to look for similar studies in similar sites and then use in some way the information that we get from those, for instance the units, willingness to pay units or something that come out of those, and transfer those and assume that they would equally apply at our new policy site. So it's a common practice because of the cost and time limitations and so on of doing primary research. So this is the overall framework then for environmental evaluation. We've talked about it several times. We've got our natural assets and ecosystems, and we're the beneficiaries, and we get these values, these human values in, they're different types of values. So they might be use values, direct use values, consumption and direct use values, or they may be non-use values like bequest and stewardship, or even these indirect values like the provision of ecosystem services that we receive a benefit from. So whereas previously we've talked about methods, for instance, the travel cost method that might try to estimate, the direct value through consumer surplus that, people are getting from traveling to and going swimming at some beach, or we might look at how much property prices are being influenced by the environment around them and so on. So we talked about methods to come up with, with these different ones, contingent valuation to try to survey people about non-use values. In this benefit transfer, we can then actually use any study that's been previously done using any of these different methods, and then take the findings from that and apply it to our policy site, our site of interest. So imagine this scenario, right? We've got a researcher, and they're interested to know, for instance, how much would people on the Sunshine Coast be willing to pay for the provision of green power, that is renewable energy. So maybe here think about you're buying energy right now from your electricity company. A certain proportion of that, if not the whole thing, is coming from coal-fired power plants. Somewhere else in Australia, and we're interested, or I'm interested in knowing, well, how much would you be willing to pay for a greater proportion of the energy you're receiving through the grid to be derived from renewable energy sources, this green power? And I happened to find this study from a similar study that was done, a willingness to pay study on how much people were willing to pay, and the situation there was in China. And so I've got that study, and I'm thinking, well, can I just take the outcomes, the finding of that study, which had these, willingness to pay values in Chinese renminbi per month, and then apply them to this population of the Sunshine Coast, right? What could go wrong? So let's have a look at that study. So here's that particular study I am referring to. So this is a willingness to pay contingent valuation study for electricity in Shenzhen, China, based on this contingent valuation method. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about when you're going through these journal papers, what you might expect to find in terms of how they set up the survey, the types of demographic and socioeconomic information they were collecting, what type of mechanism they had for the payment, and what type of data collection method they had in terms of surveys, and how they described the payment in terms of payment cards or open-ended questions and so on. So if I go here to this and look at what they found in this particular instance, well, I can see that in this particular study, they found, and I'll just, they surveyed 468 respondents, and most of them had a positive willingness to pay. So if we asked a question like, would you be prepared to pay something more for green energy, yes or no, we find that most respondents in this study indicated yes, they would. And then the follow-on questions that led to a specific dollar value that they would be willing to pay. In this case, there's an average willingness to pay of 32.63 Chinese renminbi per month. And so that equates to, roughly probably $5.50 Australia, something like that. So can I then just take that value and transfer it right over? Isn't that the whole idea of benefit transfer? And then I can say, well, that, if this previous study has been done, all that work went into it, then I'll just take the results of this and assume that people on the Sunshine Coast would be willing to pay $5.50 per month as well. Well, it's important to note some, cautionary things about doing that. First of all, we'd have to convert from, the Chinese currency to the Australian currency. We'd want to make sure that the actual year was somewhat similar so that we didn't have, issues with inflation and so on. And this particular study was, I believe, done in 2018, so relatively recent. But more importantly, we have these other factors that influence people's willingness to pay on that, and that information is often collected in these contingent valuation surveys. So for example, how old are people, or what gender are people, what's their level of education. In this particular study, they looked at things like what was their knowledge of renewable energy, what was their beliefs towards the government and actions that were being taken, what kind of previous behavior had they demonstrated in terms of, installing energy efficient appliances and that kind of thing. Had there been a history of respiratory disease with them or their household and those kind of things. And they find that in the studies, the factors that affected the people's willingness to pay included their income, right? So, and we know that from our discussion of demand and demand curves and demand functions and so on, that people's willingness to pay for different things will be influenced by their income. The more income they have, generally the more possibilities they have of purchasing different things or paying more for things that they want within their budget constraint. And they also found that, this belief and that their prior experience with disease and their gender and age all had, influences on the willingness to pay, right? And so if we were to, and here they're even saying, that in this instance in China, that men had a higher willingness to pay than females. So if we were to directly transfer this from China to Australia, we're potentially going to run into issues here, because many of those demographic and socioeconomic characteristics in the China study would not be similar to what's occurring in the Sunshine Coast. For example, if that's in the middle of an urban center, which has a lot of air pollution, pollution and presumably a higher incidence of respiratory disease, and that's not a feature of the Sunshine Coast situation, well then, maybe it'll be a different kind of influence. And maybe it won't, we can't assume that will still hold when we transfer it. Similarly, income levels are likely to be different or probably lower in China. The belief system and the prior, their knowledge of climate change, their understanding of renewable energy, education levels, those may all be quite different than the context in the Sunshine Coast. So we would want to exercise a lot of caution in directly taking that, Chinese renminbi 32.63 per month and assuming that would be the same amount that the population on the Sunshine Coast would be willing to pay per month. Okay, so consider a different scenario here. So now imagine that a researcher, again on the Sunshine Coast, is interested in generating an estimate of the value of some ecosystem service. Let's imagine carbon sequestration from coastal zone wetlands on the Sunshine Coast. And we know that coastal zone wetlands, like many other ecosystems, sequester carbon through trees and plants and so on, capture it out of the atmosphere and store it in their leaves and litter and in the soil. So we want to know how much is that ecosystem function, or some people would describe it as an ecosystem service. How much is that actually worth? And we've done this great map, and we've through a bunch of data analysis and spatial work and so on, we have now a map showing the size and the location, the spatial extent of different types of coastal zone wetlands on the Sunshine Coast. So that's here. Looking really good. So we have a total hectare area of that. And I've gone through and found a prior study that has, done some valuation on coastal zone wetlands. So let me show you that. So this comes from the environment. It's a database of studies that have previous studies that have been completed that have investigated different types of ecosystems and different ecosystem services through different kinds of methods, and then they indicate the dollar values. So for instance, here I found one. I'm quite excited. I've got this coastal wetlands. That sounds just like what I want to value, coastal wetlands. And I'm interested in carbon sequestration, but okay, well, wait a second. This particular study, maybe it's not going to work out so well because what they were valuing is different. They were valuing biodiversity protection and the preservation of the gene pool. So if I go over here and I keep going across to what they actually did and how the study was conducted. Oh, well, right away I can see it was in 1994. That's a little bit old. It was itself done by some benefit transfer. And the value that they came up with here was $169 per $169 US dollars approximately per hectare per year for that type of coastal wetland. So if I were to go back to that spatial map that I have and simply apply $169, maybe I convert it into Australian dollars, and even if I account for inflation and adjust those values and so on, it's actually measuring a different thing. It's valuing biodiversity protection. So instead, I would want to, look through this and this database and select coastal wetlands and look for a similar ecosystem service. If I'm interested in carbon sequestration, I want to be looking more at this. Well, this one's a little different. This is mangroves. So right away, my issue becomes the comparability of that existing underlying study and what I'm trying to do with it. So that gets to, really what we need in terms of the key requirements for undertaking a benefit transfer that would have process validity, okay? So these are 5 requirements that have been identified by Bennett, and these are that the biophysical conditions in the source case, so that original study site, must be really similar to those in the target case, which means that the wetlands have to be similar, right? A similar kind of climate and a similar type of flora, like that has to be comparable. Otherwise, we know, different trees sequester in different ways in different types of settings and soils and environments and so on. So the underlying biophysical conditions need to be similar. Secondly, the scale of the environmental change considered at that original source site must kind of approximate what we're trying to do at our policy site, at our target site. So if the original study looked at, a very small change, a 5% loss of a small area and derived these values, well, that may not be then applicable to a larger change that we're interested in the Sunshine Coast. Third, that the socioeconomic characteristics of the population impacted by the change, if we're thinking about willingness to pay studies and so on, that were included in that original primary study at the source site must be, similar to our target population. Fourth, that the overall frame and setting in which the valuation was made at the source must be close to that of the target, which is to say, are we valuing the same things? Are we doing a total economic value, or are we just looking at, is it a travel cost method? Is it what was the specific value and setting and scenario that was undertaken in the first place? And is that the same as what we're, investigating at our policy target site? And finally, we'd want to be sure that original study was conducted in a technically sound way. So in practice, it's often really difficult to meet all of these requirements simultaneously because, there is relatively, even though there would be hundreds of different, evaluation studies, if not thousands, for the particular, policy site we're interested in, only a subset of those original studies would be relevant. So it turns out there's actually, relatively limited studies perhaps that we can draw from. And there would be differences in the sites themselves and the scale of the change and the populations and the time frame when it was done. So those right away are kind of limiting features then when we're doing this benefit transfer. It may be that the original study was quite old. You would have seen the one in the database that I just brought up. I think was from 1994. It's highly likely that a lot of the methods used for doing environmental evaluation have improved in their accuracy and validity since that time. So those underlying studies might not be technically sound. And then we also might find that the study that we want to use, to transfer those values from may itself be a benefit transfer that got them from somewhere else. So if we're looking at, coral reefs and the original study was in Vanuatu, and then the study that we're citing had done a benefit transfer and applied that to Madagascar, and now we're taking it and applying it to the Sunshine Coast or the Great Barrier Reef, we can be introducing additional error there in those extrapolations. So let's briefly talk then about the different types of benefit transfer. So you have a kind of overview understanding about how this can be done. And this is especially important when you're, when you're opening up and when you're searching for journal articles and so on, to have a basic understanding of some of the terminology that you'll come across. And really what I want to highlight here is three different types: a unit transfer, a function transfer, and a meta-analysis. So let's go through those. So the first thing is this unit transfer. And what this is about is taking a single value estimate, usually, or a set of value estimates from some pre-existing primary study and transferring them through to the new policy site. And those could be monetary units, for example, dollars, willingness to pay per month, like was in that Chinese green power example. They could be elasticity values. You may recall in one of the earlier lectures, I think it was the travel cost, the hedonic pricing lecture, I talked about how the underlying functional form of the study, it can be linear or log linear or log log and so on. So where is it, percent change outcomes that we're transferring. It could be, these elasticity values instead. And we could do some different things like adjust those unit values. For example, I described converting the currency, adjusting for inflation, maybe adjusting them a bit based on expert opinion and so on, and then moving those values over to our new site. So this is kind of roughly the idea that previous studies would estimate some type of welfare benefit. So let's call it, for instance, the willingness to pay for green energy as per that previous study. And that study came up with a willingness to pay. And in that case, I believe it was the average willingness to pay. So this kind of willingness to pay mean. And so, can we directly take that? Well, I've already described some of the issues. Even if we do adjust for some of those things, sometimes one approach would be, well, let's look at a sample of bigger studies that have done something similar. Maybe we can find 10 different willingness to pay studies for green energy in different locations around the world. And maybe then what we'll do is take them and average them all out. So for instance, if I go back to the China example here, I believe if I come down here, so here is, for example, this part of the paper compares the results that they'd produced with prior studies. So you can see here, we've got a range of different values from other similar studies. They occur at different time frames. Some go back, it looks like, as early as 2001. Some are more recent. They use slightly different methods. For example, this looks like a contingent valuation using a payment card. Some of these other ones may be, open-ended questions and so on. They come up with these different willingness to pay. Some are per quarter, some are per year, some are per month. So we might take a sample of all of these ones here, these willingness to pay, and then maybe use a median or an average value and transfer that over. So we'll either take the one value and transfer it over and adjust it, or maybe we'll take an average of a larger group of studies of that unit that we're interested in transferring. Okay, so the second type of transfer, so I've just described unit transfer. A second type of way of doing this benefit transfer is called function transfer. So instead of taking that willingness to pay dollar value or something similar from another study, maybe it's the dollar increase in property value that comes from having a view of the ocean. Instead of taking that unit measure, now in this case with function transfer, what we do instead is we go to that original primary study, and instead we try to update that study with some data that we might have. So imagine we've got some willingness to pay, has some functional relationship, and then what we try to do is say maybe, okay, we're going to update the income variable. We're going to, this is the study from China, for example, we're going to change that over and we're going to include the Sunshine Coast income data that we have. And maybe if we don't have any other similar data, okay, well, we're going to leave these other values from the original study, and then we'll generate a new willingness to pay. So we'll generate this one based on a combination of a bit of updated superior, data that we have from the policy site, the study site we're trying to apply it to, and then we'll use the estimates, coefficient estimates and other information from these previous studies where we don't have better data. Okay, the final study is what's called meta-analysis. Sorry, this is the final type of benefit transfer. So these first two ones here, the function transfer and the unit transfer, what they're giving us is this willingness to pay. So we're going to get some kind of dollar value or something similar, that unit value there. Maybe again, it's dollar increase in house price for being close to a neighborhood park, whatever. So we're getting that unit value. In the case of meta-analysis, what we're more interested in is the influence of these other variables on that unit value. So for example, maybe here we're thinking about, well, what is the influence of income on people's willingness to pay for green energy in China? Okay, so there would have been a study. In fact, there was a whole bunch of different studies, as you saw from that example of the China paper that I brought up a minute ago. So what this meta-analysis does then is basically gets all of those willingness to pay values and treats those like the dependent variable, and then does a meta-regression where it uses all of the other study findings for these other influencing variables, income and age and gender and so on, and then through statistical regression basically tries to figure out, well, what is the, when we look across a whole bunch of studies, what can we say about the influence of age on willingness to pay for green energy? What can we say about the influence of, income on willingness to pay for green energy? So it's not producing the willingness to pay value, it's producing, a bigger analysis, a meta-analysis of the influence of these different factors on willingness to pay. And that can be useful as well. Okay, that's probably about as far as I want to go. This area of work gets quite technical quite quickly. What I really wanted to do was give you a sense of benefit transfer generally. I mean, we have to use it quite often where we don't have resources or technical expertise to undertake the primary studies that we would want to do for evaluation. So we do this benefit transfer, but there's a lot of considerations that need to be made to make sure that it occurs validly. So my interest here is in that you are familiar with, the overall types of transfers that we could do here, the unit transfer, the function transfer, and this meta-analysis, and that you have, enough familiarity that when you're opening up journal papers and so on, you get a sense of what they're describing and can draw some conclusions from that. Okay, thanks for your time.